All right, so I'll say welcome again. Thank you for joining Little Lunch Lectures today. My name is Stephanie Boret. I'm the Director of Donor Relations for the Coastal Land Trust. We are recording and we're on Facebook Live. If you would like to leave your video on, please do, but if you don't want it out on the internet, feel free to turn it off. We will be posting a couple of links in the chat, potentially of interest to you about the Coastal Land Trust, Little Lunch Lectures, and other things. So feel free to click on those links so that they open up and then you can go look at them later after we have our talk today. We'll keep everyone on mute during the talk, but at the end, if you have questions, we would love to have Q&A. So just unmute at that time and ask your question. All right. Our speaker today is Marae Lindquist. She's a doctoral student at UNCW in the Biology and Marine Biology Department, and she's studying with Dr. Ray Danner. Recently, she received the prestigious Margaret A. Davidson Graduate Fellowship, which places a graduate student at each of the 29 National Estuarine Research Reserves, and Marae's research takes place at the NER site on Masonboro Island nearby Wilmington, North Carolina. So today, Marae will share her research on Saltmarsh Sparrows and the impact of sea level rise. Thank you, Marae, for being here today.
Thanks for having me. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, can everyone see that? All right, awesome. Thank you all for coming. If my dog barks, sorry, the mailman usually comes sometime around now, so if you hear a dog barking, that's what it is. So again, hi everyone, my name is Marae Lindquist. Like Stephanie said, I'm a PhD student at UNCW and I'm working in Dr. Raymond Danner's lab. First, I would just like to thank Stephanie for inviting me to give a little lunch lecture today, and also to the whole staff at Coastal Land Trust for the super important land conservation work you do. Land and habitat management and conservation is so important for so many species, including the species I'm going to be talking about today. So you're going to hear a bit about my dissertation research, and I'm just going to kind of go over what marsh sparrows are, how marsh sparrows are impacted by sea level rise, and then a brief introduction of how we do our research and what we're doing. So salt marshes are flooded coastal wetlands that are drained by tides. They're found worldwide on every coastline in the United States. Salt marshes are extremely productive ecosystems that provide important barriers for our coastlines. They're important for the protection of our coastlines, communities, and also integral for our economy and culture. They provide essential habitat for a multitude of species, ranging from large terrestrial vertebrates to small crustaceans to fish to invertebrates and many more. North Carolina has about 225,000 acres of salt marsh, but they're being stressed by sea level rise, which is causing coastal squeeze, which is leading to loss of really important intertidal habitat. There are about 25 terrestrial vertebrate species that spend their whole lives in the tidal marsh ecosystems, and we call these marsh endemic species. Marsh endemic species, again, are species that are specialized to live in one habitat. In this case, we're going to be talking about tidal marshes. Of some of these terrestrial vertebrates we're talking about, we're going to be talking about saltmarsh and seaside sparrows today. So unless you spend a lot of time out in the marsh searching for birds or just spending a lot of time in the marsh ecosystem, you probably never run across these beautiful birds. For example, last year I was at the Wilson's Ornithological Society conference and I was talking to this really old school ornithologist, and he said he's still never seen a saltmarsh sparrow in about his some 50 years of birding. So that's why these birds are generally referred to as being pretty secretive. So unless you're in the marsh all the time and know what you're looking for, you possibly have never seen them. So a bit about saltmarsh sparrows. I really like the description they give on All About Birds, which is a website from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, so I'll just read that briefly. Wearing orange, buff, laden gray, and rusty brown, saltmarsh sparrows are flashes of color hidden in the brown expanse of tidal marshes, their only home. Look for them breeding in marshes of cordgrass, saltgrass, and needlerush in the line of Atlantic coast from southern Maine to Virginia, and wintering between Delaware and Florida. Nesting low in tidal marshes, these birds have a tenuous relationship with high tides, the highest of which sometimes inundate their nests briefly. Because of this razor-thin margin for error, saltmarsh sparrows are gravely threatened by global sea level rise. I just think that does such a nice job of succinctly describing what a saltmarsh sparrow is and what they're kind of experiencing right now. So there have been large declines in Saltmarsh Sparrow populations, researchers have seen about a 9% loss a year, which has accumulated to about a 75% loss of the population since 1998, and they're expected to go extinct by mid-century. Saltmarsh sparrows are on the IUCN Red List, the Partners in Flight Red Watch List, which is their highest conservation level. They were supposed to be up for listing as federally endangered or threatened in 2019, but that listing decision from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has been pushed back to 2023. This is giving us more time to gather some really important information on these populations to help make the best choice of listing. And now let's talk about a little bit about the seaside sparrow. Now I'm going to read you the description about the seaside sparrow from All About Birds. A drab sparrow with a short tail and a large bill. The seaside sparrow is a salt marsh specialist. Much less eloquent description of these seaside sparrows. They do look a bit drab from afar, but they are absolutely beautiful birds. The closer you can get, or if you ever have them in your hand, they're very, very intricate colored sparrows, and they're really, really beautiful. Seaside sparrows are not as much in a precarious situation as the salt marsh sparrows. They have a larger range with multiple subspecies throughout their range. Here in North Carolina, we have both migratory and year-round residents. Unlike salt marsh sparrows, we only have them in the winter. There have been two subspecies of seaside sparrows that are either endangered or extinct. The Cape Sable seaside sparrow is endangered, and the dusky seaside sparrow went extinct, and those were both subspecies that were found in Florida. Both salt marsh and seaside sparrows spend a majority of their time in Spartina and Juncus, which are two plants we find in our salt marshes. In ornithology, there is a large research bias towards breeding birds and breeding biology, but it's really important that we understand a bird's full annual life cycle, so we can really understand what's happening throughout their whole life and not just in one short period of it. The idea of full annual cycle biology is fairly new, and again, since many birds don't spend their whole lives in one area, we really need to try to find the information from all the areas of their lives, including breeding, migration, and overwinter. So today, what I'm going to be talking about mostly is in regard to the overwinter populations of these sparrows in southeastern North Carolina. So we started researching the winter populations of saltmarsh and seaside sparrows in the winter of 2019. This research was funded by, with a cooperative agreement by the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. They want to fill the gaps in knowledge of both these sparrows in North Carolina because very little work has been done regarding these winter populations. Some wonderful work was completed by Dr. Stephen Emsley and his PhD student Virginia Winder about 10 years ago, but since then there's been about virtually nothing completed. For the funding from the WRC, my research partner Evangeline Buckland has been focusing on overwinter survival and abundance, and I have been focusing on overwinter movements, habitat use, home ranges, and densities of these sparrows. For our first field season in 2019, we focused solely on Masonboro Island. That's an 8-mile-long, undeveloped barrier island off the coast of Wilmington. And if you attend a lot of little lunch lectures, you probably heard a lot about the history of Masonboro recently from Bill Rainey. Our second field season in 2020, we added a second field site at Fort Fisher State Park, which is down here, with our exact site being on Bald Head State Natural Area. And that site was absolutely beautiful, as are all of our sites. To go along with our winter population biology research, I received funding from the North Carolina Sea Grant and Sentinel Site Cooperative to model sea level rise for both Masonboro and Bald Head Island State Natural Area to understand how our winter sparrow populations will be impacted by sea level rise. There's been really good research taking place regarding the impacts of sea level rise and on breeding populations, but again, virtually nothing is known about how sea level rise will impact the winter populations, which is super important to really understand the full annual cycle of these birds, because what happens in the winter might also impact their fitness for their breeding. And then this year, I was thrilled again to receive the NOAA's Margaret A. Davidson Fellowship for North Carolina. So again, this is a new fellowship to honor the legacy of Margaret Davidson, a visionary from the coastal management world from NOAA. So there are 29 fellows, one for each of the National Estuarine Research Reserves. So I'm going to be working as the North Carolina NER Fellow. This fellowship allows us to have 2 more years of really important research on this intricate system, and also means we're going to be expanding our study spatially. So as you can see on the map, I have more than just mason burrow and baldhead highlighted. So we're going to be working on Rachel Carson Reserve, which is up here in Carteret County in light blue. We're going to be researching on Hammock's Beach State Park in this dark blue, and then also down in Bird Island, which is on the South Carolina border. This is really going to help us gather a lot more information over the whole southeastern North Carolina portion of these birds. And all this research is still in the works. So again, we did 2 field seasons, and we have 2 more. So we have a lot more information to gain. So how do we do this research? The marsh is a pretty fairly harsh and specialized environment. And since these birds live in a tidal marsh ecosystem, we can't just throw up our mist nets whenever and wherever to get this information. So first we start with mark recapture. We do this by putting mist nets up in the high tide area of the marsh. So in this picture, which was taken pre-COVID, that's why we're all so close to each other, you can see how the net is a fine mesh. So it's really easy to see in this picture because it was kind of windy day. When it's not windy, these are very hard to see. So these are really thin mesh nets, and these are called trammels, as the bird flies in the trammel and gets stuck, and then we extract it. For this field research, we actively flush our birds into the mist nets at high tide. We have to do this at high tide because these birds live in a tidal marsh ecosystem, and so at low tide, they spread out into the low marsh to go forage, and then at high tides, they get pushed up into really small areas where they aren't going to be bothered by that high water. So we're able to capture them at high abundances at high tide. And then we have to actively push them into our nets because they're not territorial in the winter and are very secretive. So they tend not to really just come out and fly into your net. So we have to actively push them out of that vegetation to get them in our mist nets. After we extract the birds, we then bring them back to a banding station. We band them with a U.S. Fish and Wildlife aluminum band. And then we take a variety of measurements. So here we were looking at wing bars. Here's a picture of us banding a bird. We were taking tarsus measurements and bill measurements, and we take plenty more than that. So for a subset of the birds, we also placed radio tags on them. So on the picture on the left, you can see a Seaside Sparrow with this black wire coming off the back. So these are really small radio tags, and here's what the base of the tag looks like. That weigh 4% or less of the bird's body weight. So we put this tag on them. It stays on them for about a month because we glue it on, not straight on their back. We put some soak on there first. We're not just gluing tags on the birds, don't worry. And this research is important, and they send out an FM signal at a regular interval, so we're able to track the birds throughout the marsh. This is important because we don't know how far these birds are spreading out at low tide, or where they go, or how they're using their habitat. The picture on the right is of our Knoll Peak radio telemetry tower that we would build every time. So we would set these up. We'd have 2 to 3 towers out in the marsh at once. We would simultaneously track a single bird, take a compass bearing when we got the best signal, and then we would come back to the lab, take those compass bearings, and triangulate where that bird was in the marsh. This allowed us to get really good density estimates because we paired our movement data and where these birds were with Evans abundance estimates to get density of our sparrows out at each of our sites. So now I'm just going to show you a really quick animation of a single bird that we tracked for a month. So this is a Saltmarsh Sparrow that we tracked from March 12th to April 11th in 2019. This blue box is our high tide netting location. So this is where we would net them. So this is where they hang out at high tides. And so each dot that's going to come up is a single time that we track them. We weren't able to get out every day. So there's some places where you're not going to see any dots, and then some where you see a lot because we track them multiple times in multiple days to see what they're doing throughout a whole tidal cycle. So here you can just see the dots are just going to pop up. And so that is where that bird moved for the whole winter, for a whole month, so not very far. So now we're going to look at a Seaside Sparrow. So this was tracked from February to March of 2019. And here, focus your attention a little bit further down the map. So this one went a little bit further than our Saltmarsh Sparrow, traveling a bit farther into that regularly flooded marsh to forage. We did have a much larger abundance of Seaside Sparrows and Saltmarsh Sparrows at our Mason Burrow site. So now moving into sea level rise. So for sea level rise, the main process is melting ice, which we have seen a lot in recent reports of some really dire observations of some melting ice sheets that have come out just this past few months. And on top of that, thermal expansion. So thermal expansion just occurs when the water warms up and then that water expands. These are both two of the primary drivers of sea level rise. Here in Wilmington, we have a really long record of our sea level because we have a monitoring station that's been up and running since the early 1900s. This has allowed NOAA to track the relative sea level trend through time. And so we can see that we're currently seeing about a 2.47 millimeter a year increase in sea level rise at our Wilmington Tide Station. So this is looking at what is occurring now and historically. And we can see that kind of here, it's not turning into a linear trend. So it's not happening at a linear trend. There are also many projections that look into the future. For example, this one is from VIMS, which is the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences. And this was a sea level rise report they created for multiple locations around the country, and Wilmington was one of the places that they looked at. They modeled out through 2050 here, and they're projecting about a 0.4 meter increase in sea level rise by 2050. They only projected out to 2050 because they were trying to do shorter term projections to get more of an accurate reading of what we think sea level rises are going to be. A lot of models are looking out to 2100. And in our case, we're looking at, for our sea level rise, we're looking at a 1, 1.5, and 2 meter sea level rise from 1990 to 2100. So along with the increase in sea level rise, we're also seeing an increase in sunny day flooding or nuisance flooding or high tide flooding. It's all the same thing, which is with different name. So you've probably seen a lot of coastal flood advisories we seem to be having all the time these days. And these are just normal day flooding events that are definitely having an impact on the breeding populations of these birds. In this picture, you can see this is a water street downtown Wilmington on the river. And this was just a normal day with no storms, nothing crazy happening, and it just floods downtown Wilmington. And this is happening much more often than we have ever seen before. I'm going to go ahead and guess that this kind of sunny day nuisance flooding is also impacting the fitness of our winter populations of these birds and not just the breeding populations. So here is an example of showing empirically that we are having, in fact, a lot more sunny day flooding days. So this is from NOAA's 2016 State of the U.S. High Tide Flooding Report. Wilmington is right here. We had the largest increase in days of sunny day flooding events of anywhere. So of all the places that I mapped, Wilmington was having a crazy increase of these just random flood events every year. I want to provide you all an example of what's occurring in the breeding grounds. Like I said, there's a lot of research occurring in the Northeast to focus on the breeding biology, which is super important, and then the impacts of climate change on these birds. This is an infrared video captured of a nest cam from PhD student Samantha Apgar from UConn. This is part of her dissertation research. So here you can see a nest that's built within the marsh grass, and you can see the eggs here. This video is going to show you the water levels rising and floating the eggs up. So here, just watch the eggs. So this water is rising and falling. The eggs are lifting with that water. And then the mom comes and sits back on the eggs. Luckily, these eggs, the tide was not high enough to carry them out of the nest, but that is an issue that is occurring in the breeding grounds. Saltmarsh sparrows have evolved to breed within a 28-day full moon cycle to avoid these periods of high water. But with sea level rise and these nuisance flooding events, their nests and chicks are getting inundated with high waters. Their eggs can withstand some amount of water inundation, but once the chicks are born, it takes about 5 to 6 days for them to grow enough to be able to climb up that marsh grass to avoid the high water. So there's a pretty precarious 5 to 6 day period once they're born where they could easily just drown from that high water. So again, this is what's occurring in the breeding ground, but we don't know how sea level rise and flooding events are impacting our winter populations of these birds. So that is why we are running sea level rise models. In my case, I've been using a program called SLAM, or Sea Levels Affecting Marshes Models, to try to get at this question. So here's an example of a sea level rise scenario I ran for Mason Barrow Island. So this is a 1 meter sea level rise by 2100. Again, we're only modeling out to 2060, but the models you have to put it inputs till 2100, then it does the calculations for you, what your sea level rise is going to be in your specific year. So here we have 2020, currently 2040 and 2060. And we can see between 2020 and 2040, that habitat significantly changes from flooded marsh to tidal flat. And then by 2060, it is mostly either tidal flat or estuarine open water. Our birds cannot live in tidal flats or estuarine open water. Tidal flats are too exposed and there's no vegetation for them to hide in. This is happening, it would change to these vegetation type because the water just gets too high and that marsh grass just can't sustain in these that elevated water level. Now looking at Bald Head State Natural Area, again, 1 meter sea level rise by 2100. We have 2020, 2040, and 2060. And we can see most of it was regularly flooded marsh in 2020. And then that changes to tidal flat by 2040 and then estuarine open water by 2060. So this is not looking good for our sparrows. One thing though, these do not account for any mitigation or adaptive strategies to put into the marsh. So this doesn't account for any shoreline restoration we're doing, any thin layer deposition. This just accounts for what we're seeing right now looking into the future, but not taking into account anything that we would do to try to adapt for that. So this is a drone video that was taken by a film study students that came out into the field with us. They made a short video about our research for their film studies class. I like this clip because I think it has a nice comparison between an undeveloped barrier island, that is Mason Barrow, compared to one that's heavily developed and cut off by roads, which is going to be Wrightsville Beach. So although Mason Barrow might not be able to mitigate much due to the fact that their barrier island it's an island that can't move a whole lot, places like Wrightsville Beach might be even worse off because there's just hard structures everywhere and not really anywhere for the land to move. So let's go ahead and watch that. So we can see that large marsh expanse of Mason Barrow. All of this is going to be regularly flooded marsh. Absolutely beautiful. And then looking over on Wrightsville Beach, and it's just houses and hard structures throughout that whole area of land. So although we might not be able to necessarily save the saltmarsh sparrows, this research is really important. Saltmarsh sparrows can also be seen as an umbrella species, meaning the conservation efforts applied to them will likely have really important impacts on other populations and other species. For example, the seaside sparrows, although they have pretty stable populations now and don't seem to be as imperiled by sea level rise yet, the sea level rise projections we are seeing, it's hard to imagine that this is going to be the case into the future. So our mitigation strategies and adaptive conservation efforts we put in as soon as possible for our saltmarsh sparrows will likely have really important impacts and long-lasting impacts for other species, even if we don't end up being able to really sustain that saltmarsh sparrow population. Again, we're doing this research to fill the gaps in knowledge, but also try to help conserve a species and create a framework for understanding how to best study these secretive marsh birds in the winter. And the best way to find adaptive management strategies for these species in the future by working with partners and entities that really make these on-the-ground decisions. So we think this research is really important. I hope you guys do too. These birds need our help. If you would like to read more about this is a really good article that came out recently about, it has a ton of information about why sea level rise is affecting these marsh sparrows, mostly in the breeding grounds. And it's talking with a bunch of amazing folks that do this research up in the Northeast that are part of the SHARP team, which is Saltmarsh Avian Habitat Research Program. So if you'd like to read more, that's a great article. So again, for the next 2 years, we're really going to be trying to get at all these questions, and I'm excited to talk to you about that in the future. One thing, we are switching up the way we're going to be doing telemetry. So instead of having those telemetry towers where we have to manually do it, we got this new system called Cellular tracking technologies, where we just put this system out in the marsh and that it autonomously collects information on the birds for us with little tags that are solar paneled. So we're going to be able to get really high resolution data on these birds for a whole month out of their month to 6 weeks out of their life, to really see how they're moving in their winter grounds. So this can be really important to keep this research going and see what's really happening with new technologies and see if that impacts what we're seeing at all. So I would like to thank the Danner Lab, which is like the most supportive, wonderful lab I could ask for. And I'm so happy to be doing my PhD with them. I'd also like to thank my research partner, Evan. She is finishing up on her thesis on survival and abundance right now, and she graduates in December. She's going to be my technician this winter, but she is graduating. So if you guys need an awesome biology graduate, she is out there. Also, I would like to thank my two awesome field technicians from last field season. So Sophia and Cassidy, they helped me on my Sea Grant, Sentinel Site grant, and they were absolutely great. I would not have been able to do this research without them. They kept me sane and helped me. And then thank you all to my funding sources, Wildlife Resources Commission, Sea Grant, Sentinel Site Cooperative, NOAA, NCNR, UNCW, and Cape Fear Audubon Society, and all the partners we work with to make this research possible, such as the NCNR, NC State Parks, and NC Audubon for access to their properties. This is truly collaborative research, and we couldn't do it without everyone helping us. So thank you all. I'm here to take any questions. Follow us at Danner_lab if you want to see what we're doing in our lab. And then you can email me or check out my website if you want to learn more or have any questions for me outside of this. Thank you. I hope I didn't last too long.
No, you're fine. No, that was right on time and very, very cool, very interesting research.
Thanks.
Does anybody have any questions? Now would be a good time to unmute your microphone and ask. Kathy, do you have a question?
I don't know. I don't know if I have one right at the minute, but I enjoy the presentation. I can tell you that.
Thanks, Mom. You can ask me the questions anytime if you ever have any.
No, I enjoyed the slideshow and the pictures and everything, and having been out there, you know, it was great to see it and know what's happening out there.
Thanks. I forgot to add photo cred for you. Sorry.
Oh, that's right. I took that one.
Nice.
Maria, I'm curious, so that the framework for the study is that it's climate change and sea level rise. And when thinking about climate change, there seem to be at least two different components to it. One is that constant push of sea level rise, as you were showing in the graphs from VIMS and the other modeling from the area, and that's certainly going to be a really important one. And we could start asking questions about geologic timescale and how that might work. But what I'm curious about at the moment is the relative importance of that constant push from things like sea level rise versus other impacts of climate change. And of course, the one that we're all paying attention to at the moment, or should be, is that, you know, just the number of storms in the Atlantic, the increasing frequency and intensity of those storms. I'm thinking about my question is really about the relative impact of those two different types of impacts from climate change, and how you're thinking about that for your study.
Yeah, we don't necessarily have to think as much about that because we're doing the winter population. So we're not working with those storm events necessarily, but there was a paper recently that came out from, I think, Fields et al. I think it was 2019, where they looked at the impacts of hurricanes and major storms events on these birds. And they were seeing it wasn't as much of an impact as they thought it would be, which was surprising. So I think they're seeing that from that paper, it looked like the sea level rise is more of an impact than these major storm events that they're seeing. But that could change with intensity and its severity of the storms. But again, we're not having to worry about that as much in the winter. We could maybe be worrying more about like really extreme cold or warm temperatures that could be, or like extreme rainfall events. But those, we don't put any of that into the model, but it is really important to think about for like how we can look at that into the future. But they are looking at that for the breeding grounds.
Part of that, what you're showing is that really tight range, that really they're hyper localized in how they're using that space. And so it seems to me that they're incredibly vulnerable to one-time excursion in the environment, whether that's temperature, rainfall, or wind, or whatever that might be.
Yeah, we're looking at survival too. And they do seem to, they're very site specific. So they have pretty high site fidelity. So we were seeing that within season, they had high site fidelity. And then also between seasons, they were having high site fidelity. So we had a lot of birds come back to the same site at Mason Burrow the next year. Like for the tagged Saltmarsh Sparrows, 75% of the birds that we tagged in year one, we got, or like the radio tagged birds, we recaptured in year two. So they're having really high site fidelity. So if that one specific area gets pretty inundated or something happens, I think it's gonna impact on their fitness because they don't seem to have that major flexibility to move.
I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the differences in sort of home range and habitat use between the two species that you talked about.
Yeah. So we have been seeing that the Saltmarsh Sparrows are using more like the Spartina alterniflora, the short form, to really hang out. So that really short Spartinas, they seem to be hanging out most of their time there. The home ranges, we didn't see a significant difference in sites, but it was pretty close. So the home ranges of Saltmarsh Sparrows seem to be a bit smaller than Seaside Sparrows. But again, it wasn't significant, but it was almost significant, but not quite 0.05. So the Saltmarsh Sparrows are using smaller home ranges, and Seaside Sparrows, I'm sorry, I don't have this slide up right now. Actually, I can pull it up real quick if you would like to see the specific home ranges they're using at our sites. Let me just share my screen real quick. So this was kernel density estimates for our Mason Burrow site. So this was the home ranges at low tide for Saltmarsh Sparrows and then Seaside Sparrows. And again, we had a much higher abundance of Saltmarsh Sparrow or Seaside Sparrows at this site than we did at the other one. And then for our Fort Fisher Baldhead site, we saw it was two Saltmarsh Sparrows really driving this increase in home range size. And then we had 4 others that stayed pretty close. So they were pretty similar at Fort Fisher Baldhead, but we had about equal abundance of sparrows there. Whereas at Mason Burrow, we had a pretty stark difference in abundance of those birds. So we are also really interested in looking at difference in ages. So we're gonna really try to focus on that the next 2 field seasons, because the 2 birds at Fort Fisher that went way further out were both immature birds, and the ones that stayed close were adults. So we really want to see if that's maybe driving some of the differences in home ranges as well. But we are seeing that Saltmarsh Sparrows stay pretty close in that Spartina alterniflora, and Seaside Sparrows like the Juncus when it's high, and then Spartina when it's low. And so, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Marae, I had a follow-up about the differences between the 2 species, and I was curious if, like, do you have a sense about why the Seaside is not as imperiled as the Saltmarsh, or not yet, since they are kind of coexisting in similar spaces and experiencing similar impacts?
Yeah, they seem to not be like as specific in where they will go. They'll spread out a bit further. The Saltmarshes do seem pretty specific to like that short form alterniflora when they have that option to be there. And again, that's just what we've been seeing. So I'm not really sure. I think it could be breeding ground reasons. We haven't looked at diet yet. We would like to look at diet, maybe see if they're eating something a little different from each other. But we're still trying to get at these questions of like why Saltmarsh Sparrows or why Seaside Sparrows maybe can use more habitat and stuff. So.
Hey, Marae, we've had a question from Facebook. Are you aware of the potential river deepening projects being proposed by the NC ports and potential impacts on our ecosystems?
I am not aware of the deepening projects, but we were out on the river fairly recently helping Audubon with some tern banding, and one of the really new huge ships came by, and it was insane. It threw a wake that was so large that it tore 2 of our boats from their anchors and push them around the island. And I can see how that might have really, really dire impacts for these birds. Again, maybe not so much in the winter grounds unless it's like eroding that habitat, which it will be if we're having these really crazy big ship wakes happening. It's going to just erode that more and more. That could really be bad for the breeding populations, though. If you get that really high water that comes in, it could just easily just flood a nest out. And we do have breeding populations of seaside sparrows here. We're just not focusing on them. So yeah, I can see that having some really bad impacts for these birds. And we've seen it happen with that being on the river with these big ships coming by. Maybe they could possibly, if they cut down their speed in which they're coming up the river, not that has to do with it widening, but that could potentially have an impact of not sending as big of a wake up for the birds. So, Dr. Barrett, I see your question in the chat. So potential impacts of interspecific competition. We would like to look at that. We haven't done it yet, really. We're also trying to get at like why we're seeing different abundances at different sites. And that seems like an important aspect to get at, of like why one site has more salt marsh and one has more seaside. If that's driving it more than interspecific competition or interspecific competition, we're still trying to get at all that, but it could be a reason we might see more one species or another, but it also potentially might be habitat usage and all that jazz. Not sure yet. Good question.
Are there any further questions before we move to the end of our little lunch lecture? Very good. Thank you so much, Marae. Really appreciate you taking the time to be with us and to share your research with us. I clearly don't spend enough time in Saltmarsh just for lots of reasons, but next time I'm there, I will be keeping my eyes open for different little guy species. It's a little bit easier to see some of those big birds sometimes.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. I want to thank everybody again for participating today. We do have another little lunch lecture next week. Anne and Bland Simpson will take us on a second photographic and narrative tour, this time of the inner islands of North Carolina. If you were with us a few months back, they took us on a tour of the whole Eastern North Carolina, and it was really, really cool to see some beautiful photos and hear some stories. I'll let you know what we're doing on October 2nd. We don't have it planned yet, but we will have the Coastal Fed will be talking about oyster restoration on October 9th. So that's the next one that's scheduled, but stay tuned for the second. But in between, we will be having our annual celebration on September the 26th. It's a Saturday from 5 to 6:15. It is free to attend, but it is a fundraiser. We'll kind of keep you wondering what that might be specifically fundraising for. There is a very special reason this time. So y'all go to coastallandtrust.org/RSVP. Let us know you're coming, get the Zoom link, and join us. And hear all about the lands that we saved this year and hear about what's coming next. So we do look forward to seeing you all again at one of our upcoming virtual events, and someday we'll see you again in real life. Hope you have a wonderful weekend, and we'll talk soon. Thanks.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Yeah, no problem. So glad to have you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.